Luke chapter 5 is one of my favorite chapters in the book of Luke. We talked before about how Luke, as a gospel writer, like every gospel writer, is taking Polaroid snapshots of Jesus and arranging them in his own personal picture book. So each picture, each Polaroid, is absolutely true, but it may be arranged in a little different order than some of the other Gospels. In some cases, different pictures were chosen by Luke than were chosen by the other Gospel writers. And that's the case here in Luke chapter 5. This is the only picture we have like this in any of the Gospels, this marvelous calling of Peter and the other fishermen. He writes, on one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, meaning Jesus was standing there, and he saw two boats by the lake. But the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. In an era before microphones, before additional volume that could come from having one, how would you get hundreds, if not thousands, of people to hear what you were saying? Jesus spent a lot of time around the Sea of Galilee in what are called natural amphitheaters. He would be at the shore with the people stretching above him in the hills, and they could hear much of what he would say. Now, in this case, they pressed so closely to him that he actually goes out just a little ways in the boat, still in the natural amphitheater, but he has one of the fishermen, Simon, whom he knows very well, to put him out there while he teaches. The Lake of Gennesaret, we call the Sea of Galilee, was about 6 miles wide at its widest point. That's about 1/5 as wide as Lake Okeechobee. So still, a 6-mile wide lake is not anything to sneeze at, but it's not huge like Lake Okeechobee. It is a smaller lake. In modern Israel, the real concern is that the lake would dry up. So much of it is used for agriculture, for irrigation, that the Israelis have built a desalination plant on the coast of Galilee and are running a pipe over to the sea in order to keep pumping it full of water to keep the level at a certain place. Now, one thing you need to realize about Jesus' time, and that is that commercial fishing was a relatively new thing, maybe just in the last 100 years. Now, people had fished the lake for hundreds and hundreds of years, but to commercially fish it in a viable way to make big money, or enough money to have a couple of companies of fishermen doing this, that was new. That was a little bit different. Peter and his partners were in on the cutting edge, as it were, of this economic enterprise. Now, when you're talking about fishing in the lake, in the Sea of Galilee, you're not talking about throwing a hook in and pulling out fish. These are small fish, by and large. You catch them with nets, and they're essentially a variety of sardine. And the point of catching these in great numbers is to transport them south to the big city, to Jerusalem. But you can't just throw fish in a bucket and send it there. You've got to salt them to preserve them. And so it was a big deal. I mean, you had to catch these fish and then salt them carefully, put them in barrels, and they would be taken down to Jerusalem and sold in the markets there. And you could make a pretty good living. Now, in order to catch these sardines, you had to use nets. These were linen nets made of flax. And as such, they were not like nylon. They had to be constantly maintained. There would, when you rub them on the side of a boat using them, or the weight of the fish, or just the natural rot that would occur from getting wet, they required a lot of maintenance. Every morning after you had fished, you would drag them up onto the side of the lake I guess, onto some sawhorse kind of things, and you would go through and look through your net to mend it. These nets were also weighted, and so you would occasionally have to maintain the weights, replace them as one or two fell off. This was what the majority of time was for fishermen. In your mind, you think that most of the time is out fishing. Well, a good bit of it is, but there was at least an equal amount of time maintaining these nets. It took a long time, and it was hard work. These nets worked in one of two ways. Now, if you were a small operation, you might use a cast net. I've lived down here in Southwest Florida long enough to see lots of people use cast nets to catch bait fish that they then use to fish with. But for a big commercial operation, probably like Peter's, you're talking about a trammel net, which essentially is you're making a huge trap to catch fish. And you have to lay this net out in a circle, and it's weighted, and it comes down. And when the fish are scared inside a circle, they run and get stuck in the net in large numbers. And you and your buddies spend, a good long while pulling it up with all the fish. That's how these things operated. And the fishing was done almost exclusively at night. I guess that's when the fish were out running around. You'll see that here at the Sea of Galilee, there was even a town called Magdala, which means the place of salted fish. So Mary Magdalene literally means Mary from the place of salted fish. It's what they did every evening. This is what a first century Galilean boat looked like. It was smaller than a school bus, would hold 4, maybe 5 guys. And you spent most of your time rowing. If the wind was perfect, you might let the sail down, but most of the time it was a lot of rowing. Because you were fishing at night, you were in and out of the water a lot with your nets. A lot of these guys fished naked, and that was how they got their operation done. It was just a whole lot easier. In 1986, a first century Galilean fishing boat was discovered in the mud of the Sea of Galilee. As the lake water went down during a drought, this was revealed in the mud, and archaeologists carefully dug it up and preserved it. And if you go to Israel, you can see exactly what one looks like at a museum there in Galilee. Now, it says here that when Jesus finished speaking to the crowds, he said to Simon, "Row out farther into the deep water and drop your nets for a catch." Now, this next verse always interests me. Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When my wife and I were first married, we began to study the Bible together as a couple. And I remember one of the very first nights as we studied, we came across this verse. And we had a disagreement. And it revealed to me the difference in our upbringing. I was raised in a family of 3 boys. There was a lot of teasing, a lot of smart aleck, a lot of sarcasm, a lot of just a lot of teasing among 3 boys. And so, to my mind, what I hear Peter doing is being sarcastic. Now, sure, Jesus is a great Bible teacher, a great leader, can do miracles, but he's been raised as a carpenter away from the lake for 30 years. Peter and his family, his partners, are professional fishermen. They've been doing this all their lives. They know about fish. They know how to fish this lake. That's all they do. So, in my mind, maybe because of my upbringing, what I hear Peter being is sarcastic. Well, because you say so, we'll go do it. I'm not sure this will work out. In fact, I'm pretty sure it won't in Peter's mind. Because Jesus is saying, I want you to put out in the daytime. It's the wrong time to go fishing. I want to put you to put out in the deep water. That's the wrong water depth to go fishing. This was all shallow or more or less shallow fishing. And in Peter's mind, they've got to drag the nets back off the sawhorses, back into the water, and waste, I don't know how many hours, getting them wet again and drying them off again and repairing them. Jesus is asking a big deal here. And my wife, however, was raised in a very sweet family. And so what she hears is Peter being absolutely honest. Lord, I trust you, and I'm going to do that because you say so. Now, I thought that was sweet but naive, and she disagreed, and our disagreement was such that we couldn't study together for a while. It's funny what you learn about someone in marriage and how long it takes to straighten them out. And when they had done this, when they went and took their nets out in the deep water in the daytime, which they really didn't want to do, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. And they signaled to their partners in the other boat for them to come and help them. And they came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. I mean, this is an astonishing catch. I think this is why Luke chooses this picture to record for us, because this whole chapter is about amazing, unusual, astonishing things that really cause people to, I don't believe this is happening kind of thing. And for Peter and for James and for John and the rest of his employees and extended family, whoever was involved in the business, this was probably something they had never experienced before. And Peter's reaction, to me, seems to confirm my cynical view. When Simon Peter saw that, he fell down at Jesus' feet, saying, "Depart from me, O Lord, for I am a sinful man." Now, to my simple mind, I cannot think of any reason why Peter would react that way unless he was extremely skeptical about going and doing what Jesus said. Now, he might have said, "Yeah, I'll go do it." But in my cynical mind, I'm thinking he did not think this would work at all. And I think that's why he reacts the way he did. My wife will, of course, give you the contrary view. But I notice what's interesting is how Peter's whole tone, whole attitude has changed in what he says here. Before, he calls Jesus Master, which is kind of like saying boss. But now, he says Lord. You own me. I'm just your servant. You're beyond anything I had thought possible. And Luke refers to Simon now by his later nickname that Jesus gave him, Peter. Simon Peter. I don't know if Luke is hinting that in this moment Peter had grown up in his faith. Certainly he was astonished. But to call himself a sinful man, I can only think it's because of what he felt in his heart, at least skepticism that this was going to work. Maybe he wasn't as sarcastic as I think, but he had to at least be thinking, there's not a way in the world this is going to work, or else I don't understand his reaction here. In any case, it says, again, we're going with pictures in this chapter that are astonishing, that are amazing. It says, "For Peter was amazed, and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish which they had caught." This just doesn't happen. I mean, sure, we've had some good nights, but this is off the charts. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. I guess they owned the other boat of the two. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. And perhaps that's the point of this particular miracle. The only way The only way you are going to impress a fisherman is to do something astounding with fish. And that's what Jesus does. That's something that they have no explanation for. Perhaps the only thing that would impress fishermen to follow him. Jesus says, from now on you will be catching men. What does Peter think that means? What does that mean, we're going to catch men? I guess if Peter thinks deeply about it, he realizes that they are going to begin attracting people to this new direction, this new following, this new evangelism that's going on. And Peter, I think, realizes, well, if he can catch fish like this, what are we going to do with men? I mean, it's open-ended here, what the possibilities are from what he has seen. But now don't underestimate what Peter is giving up. Peter and James and John are small business owners. They're not hobbyists. They're walking away from their business. I cannot imagine going home to Peter's wife and saying, you know, we've decided to stop fishing, turn it over to the employees and to your younger brother Wally, and we're just going to follow this guy wherever he goes because we're going to catch men. And I cannot imagine what her reaction would be. And yet, these small business owners are stepping out on faith. Now, as small business owners, they're better off than many other people. I don't mean that they're wealthy, but they're certainly solidly middle class because they've been able to earn a living from their company in a way that many other people can't. Their business is not seasonal like a farmer's business. They can fish every night there in the lake. And so they turn it over to their families, I suppose, to continue as they walk off into an unknown future. This is tremendous faith, but they have tremendous reason to have that faith from what they've just seen. And now we move on to another amazing story. Luke pulls out his next Polaroid and puts it down here. And if you had lived in that time, this would have seemed amazing to you. It says in Luke 5 and verse 12, and it happened when he was in a certain city that, behold, a man who was full of leprosy saw Jesus, and he fell on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now, you have to understand that biblical leprosy was terrifying to people. It was thought to be extremely contagious. And that's what makes modern scientists scratch their heads, because modern leprosy is not contagious. In fact, it's among the hardest diseases to get in the world. If you look in the Guinness Book of World Records, at least when I looked a few years ago, it said that Hansen's disease, modern leprosy, is the hardest disease to get. So what's happened? I don't know if we're talking about a different disease in Jesus' time, or if the disease, like some diseases, start out very virulent, killing their hosts, and then over time become less so that the disease can continue to thrive. Here in America, with the advent not only of modern medicines, but the setting up of 2 leper colonies, one in Hawaii and one in Louisiana, lepers were all quarantined and cured, and I don't know anybody in modern America who has leprosy. Now, maybe there's somebody, but it's a rare disease. But in their time, it was terrifying. You didn't want to touch someone. Nobody knew what caused it exactly, but you knew you didn't want to come into contact with anybody. In fact, you didn't want to come close to somebody who had leprosy. And so there were all kinds of rules for lepers. If you were a leper, by law, you could not come within 6 feet of another person, including your own family. Leprosy was among the loneliest sentences that you could ever receive. Because in order to protect the people around you and the general citizenry, you could not be near anybody. You could not come within 150 feet if you were upwind of a crowd or of any individual. You had to wear torn clothing so people could see you were a leper. You couldn't just wear normal stuff because people might not know. Your hair had to hang loose. It couldn't be tied up. And if anybody made the mistake of coming around the corner towards you unawares, it was your legal responsibility to shout, "Unclean, unclean," and the person would have time to back away and get away from you. And as a leper, you either lived alone or you lived with other lepers. A terrible, terrible fate. Completely dependent on the alms of good people. They would set their bowls out on the side of the roads and then retreat into the bushes, and people would plink coins in, and that would be the only way that you could survive. And most of all, worst of all perhaps, was that the rabbis taught that people who were sick probably had secret sin in their lives. That's why God had caused them to be sick, because they were sinful somehow. And that's why they had been stricken. What a terrible fate. Now, this man breaks every single rule. Jesus is in a town which by law this man could not be anywhere near. And this man comes with leprosy into the town, and when he sees Jesus, he falls on his face and begs him, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." So the man breaks the rules. He's in town. He has come near other people. He hasn't hollered out his warning, "Unclean, unclean." But he doesn't care. He has great faith. And he's taking a huge risk. And Jesus answers the man who broke all the rules by himself breaking all the rules. Then he put out his hand and touched him. He put out his hand and touched him. That just doesn't happen. To the people of that time, that would be astonishing. You've got to be crazy to touch a leper. Jesus said, "I am willing, be cleansed," and immediately the leprosy left him. He didn't care about the danger of touching a leper. All he cared about was showing compassion and showing that he was willing and showing his power that he had cleansed him. Not in a few minutes, if you go off down the road there, it'll slowly get better. It was instantly clean. People were astonished. Jesus ordered him, "Don't tell anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." If by some miracle a leper ever went into remission and appeared to be cleansed, he would show himself to a priest who would be responsible for examining his body, confirming it, and then there would be a sacrifice of thanks made to God. And he tells the leper, "Go do that." But it's interesting, Jesus says, why does he not want this man to tell anyone? Well, because obviously people are going to find out. They know that Larry has had leprosy his whole, for years and years, and now here he doesn't. They're obviously going to know, and they're obviously going to ask why. So why does Jesus say, "Don't tell anybody"? I think in one sense it was to be seen as humbled. In other words, Jesus, when this man would relate what had happened to him, Jesus would come across as a very humble teacher of God's Word. I think the second reason might be to limit responses from others, especially lepers. One of the very, very hardest things I do every day is when people come and knock on our door looking for help. Now, to you that may not be a big deal, but human nature being what it is, if I choose to help one person, what will happen? That another person will come, having heard from him, and another person. And I've had it happen before, where I've had a dozen people come over the course of a day looking for a handout. And I have no idea, I have my suspicions, but I have no idea whether they're worthy or not. And if any of y'all want to come and volunteer and sit in the lobby and handle this for me, I would really appreciate it. Because I have to do my best judgment on whether or not to help somebody. And I know full well I'm not perfect in my judgment. And sometimes I do it well, and sometimes I don't. But one thing that I do know about human nature, if you help people, they will come back or other people will come back. And maybe what Jesus is doing here is, look, I'm in the middle of a very public ministry preaching from town to town. If every leper comes running into town and wants me to heal them, that ain't going to help things, at least as far as my ultimate mission is. I don't mind helping people, but it's an obstacle to being able to preach publicly if you are inundated by people who have leprosy. Another reason might be to keep a lower political profile. His time has not yet come. If he becomes too famous too quickly, he brings himself under the notice of the Romans, of Herod, the king of Galilee. He's got stuff to do. He does not need that notoriety right now. I think another reason might be to show his obedience to the law. He told the leper to go do what the law said, and so anyone hearing this would understand Jesus' respect for the law. And then lastly, it may just be reverse psychology. Don't tell anybody. And what's going to happen? He's going to tell everybody. He's at least going to tell the priest he goes to, and the priest is going to learn all about it. There's a guy who's healing leprosy out here. I got to go see more about this. Interesting. Jesus says, don't tell anyone. But it didn't matter. The news spread. The news about him was spreading even farther, and large crowds were gathering to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus himself would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. My daddy would often tell me, or I would say, when I grow up, maybe I want to be president of the United States when I'm 8 or whatever, when I say that. And I remember my dad always said, I have no interest in being president of the United States. And I thought that was the oddest thing, because if you're the president, you're powerful and, everybody has to respect you. He did not want that notoriety. And I think because when you become famous, when you are the leader of a movement, your time is less and less your own. You're constantly being asked to do something, constantly being asked to say something, constantly being asked to appear somewhere. And Jesus has to look for those times. It says often he would slip away to be with his Father, to pray. And that's not easy to do when you're in Jesus' situation, because the news about him and what he's done is spreading like wildfire. You won't believe this guy. And then that takes us to Luke chapter 5, verse 17, and Luke pulls out another Polaroid picture of astonishing things. On one of these days, as he was teaching, Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was with him to heal. Now, you and I think of Pharisees as kind of bad guys, maybe. But for the Jews of that day, they were held in high esteem. They were paragons of virtue. They were the supermen of the Jewish religion. They represented about 5% of the people. The Jews considered, or the rabbis taught, that there were 613 laws in the Old Testament. And the Pharisees were expected to know each one of them and to keep each one of them perfectly. That was such a full-time job, I'm not surprised there's only 5% of the people who could even aspire to do that. But if you did manage to become a Pharisee, a great teacher of the law, then you wore a particular costume so people would know you're a Pharisee. People would show you great deference, and you were expected to show great piety. And so these men were the rabbis. They were the teachers of the law throughout all the villages. It says they came from Galilee, from in the north, to hear Jesus. They came from Judea in the south to hear Jesus. They came from the big city of Jerusalem to hear Jesus. Now the priests and that group of people in Jerusalem were the Sadducees. They were only about 2% of the people, much more interested in keeping the temple running. In some sense, they saw themselves as sin eaters. In other words, we'll do whatever we have to do in order to keep the temple going. If that means we have to cooperate with the Romans, let them kill a few Jews, we'll do whatever we need to. The Sadducees were not nearly as pious in the minds of the people as were the Pharisees. But Jesus is here healing in the power of the Spirit. It said some men came carrying a paralytic on a mat and tried to take him into the house to lay him before Jesus. So 4 guys are carrying a guy on a mat, a man who's paralyzed. When they could not find a way to do this, because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles into the middle of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. And our first reaction as modern people is, well, how rude can you be to start tearing off this roof? It's going to take forever to repair it. Not exactly. In Jesus' time, roofs were easily accessible. It's where people would go in the cool of the evening to cool off. And it wasn't very thick stucco. You could get that off and then go to the tiles underneath and stack them. This isn't exactly like the Jesus' time, but you can see how the roof of this particular thing could be easily taken apart and put back together. So they weren't really doing too much damage to the house. I wouldn't have been happy about it if I owned the house, but it wouldn't have been that big a deal. And Jesus sees their faith, not the paralytic's faith, the faith of the men who let him down through the roof. And he said to the paralytic, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." Because Jesus saw the need that the man had that was greater than merely his paralysis. And next week, we'll take up from here and see what happens in the next astonishing story.